Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I am the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks, and we are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from my office located in Piscataway and Susquehannock Land, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Andy Bissonnette. Andy is a recent MFA graduate from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and he's a potter and educator currently residing in Lincoln, Nebraska. He is acutely interested in the union of form, surface, and utility, and the relationship between clay, body, and glaze. He is interested in historical uses of pottery, both narrative and utilitarian, and often looks to the past when conceiving his work. His influences are far and many, ranging from Northern Song Dynasty, Celadons, the form language developed by the ancient Greeks, to the modernist aesthetic of the Bauhaus in Germany. For more information about our artist talks, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org and tune in for our next artist talk on Tuesday, January 7th with Lee Taylor Nicholson from 12:30 to 1:30. I will now turn it over to Andy.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Give everyone just a couple updates since I've moved around since I gave you that last bio, but I'm now residing in Moorhead, Minnesota. So back in my home state of Minnesota, and I'm teaching kind of oddly enough, but graphic design. And so I'll kind of dive into within this presentation my work within pottery, but how it relates to design and how I worked professionally within that industry, and how I've kind of used those two types of media to create this work. All right, since I was a young child, I've been fortunate enough to be surrounded by creative and thoughtful artists, designers, and makers. My dad is an architect, someone who I looked up to for years, and whose career path I intended to chase after high school. I also have uncles, cousins, and countless friends whose creative endeavors have helped shape me into the person I am today. Growing up surrounded by these like-minded individuals would eventually lead me into a career within the arts, but not the straightforward path that we often expect when heading off to college. My ceramics journey begins in the fall of 2001, my senior year of high school, where I finally had precedence to take my first wheel throwing class. This was a popular class at Hopkins High School, a school in the western suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the idea of taking this class had appealed to me since an older friend had taken it a few years prior. Unbeknownst to me, I was engaging in a tradition whose roots are embedded deep within this region. For those unfamiliar with the Minnesota aesthetic, I'll give you a very abbreviated history of contemporary studio ceramics in the region. In 1949, Warren Mackenzie traveled from northeastern Illinois to Cornwall, England to study with the father of British studio pottery, Bernard Leach, and Shoji Hamada, a Japanese living national treasure. Mackenzie apprenticed at the Leach Pottery for 3 years before returning to the States and eventually starting his own pottery in Stillwater, Minnesota, a riverfront town just 35 minutes east of Minneapolis, and teaching at the University of Minnesota. For over 35 years while at the U and continuing until his death in 2018, Warren's ethos of creating pottery for the people, or the Japanese concept of Mingei, influenced a generation of studio potters that still lives on to this day. While I may not have realized at the time, there is no doubt in my mind that this history of studio ceramics was seeping into my blood. As my time in high school came to a close, I enrolled in the pre-architecture program at North Dakota State University. As I mentioned, my dad's an architect, and as a 17-year-old, following in his footsteps seemed like a logical choice. Like many architecture programs, being accepted into the school was strictly based on GPA, and at the time, I was not a very academically motivated student. After not being accepted into the program, I took the advice of an advisor and enrolled in the graphic design program at Minnesota State University Moorhead, a neighboring university. MSUM implemented the Bauhaus theory of art and design, where students familiarize themselves with new materials, color, and form before declaring an emphasis in design, craft, or fine art. I learned how to see and distill objects into simple shapes, to draw and understand how light interacts with the subject, and build a simple artist toolkit that still comes in handy when conceiving and sketching pottery forms today. I also learned about the principles of design, such as hierarchy, repetition, pattern, movement, space, balance, and unity, all concepts that I employ in the objects that I make. In this magazine layout, you can see how the designer used these principles to develop the spread. I've added cyan grid lines to show you the underlying structure, the framework we as designers use to align the content. You can see the use of hierarchy in the large headline at the top of the page and the subsequent subheads, body copy, and photos that are arranged in a way to guide the viewer through the article. While this may seem intuitive and unremarkable, designers are constantly thinking about how these principles and how we can employ them to produce a positive user experience. While I was learning how to apply these principles within traditional design, I still wasn't considering how design thinking could be harnessed in my ceramics work. For as long as I can remember, I've struggled with finishing work. The process of throwing, trimming, and assembling pots was so fulfilling, but glazing and applying surface embellishments never came easily. I was utilizing a glazing technique often referred to as dip and done, where little to no consideration as to how the glaze interacts with the form as given, or how we can activate the surface to enhance the overall composition of the pot. It wasn't until 2015, 7 years after I had finished my undergraduate degree, that I finally applied the theories that I had learned about design to my pots. I began grading my pots and creating patterns in Adobe Illustrator. I'm extremely adept with the Creative Suite, so utilizing these programs as a tool for making pots seemed like a no-brainer. I researched different techniques for applying patterns on pots and carved my first geometric pattern into clay. This process seemed intuitive and ultimately felt like a technique that I could incorporate into my practice. I had never felt so comfortable embellishing the surface of my pots, so this new development was exciting and rewarding. From 2015 until the summer of 2020, when I eventually started grad school, I continued to evolve and refine this new body of work and eventually embraced a firing style known as Western raku. Traditionally, raku is a type of Japanese pottery used for the tea ceremony, which involves pulling the piece from the kiln while still red hot and allowing them to cool naturally in the open air. Westerners adapted this technique during the mid-20th century, but instead of allowing the pieces to cool in the air, they submerged them in metal containers full of combustible materials. This process of reduction cooling has a dramatic effect on glazes containing high amounts of metal oxide and produces results that are bold and striking. Unhappy with the glazed surfaces I was achieving, I eventually forewent the glazing process completely and began reducing my still porous pots and garbage cans full of sawdust to achieve a carbon-trapped effect. This was the birth of my black pottery. The importance of the porosity of the vessels is that they absorb carbon in the smoky atmosphere, which develops the rich black surfaces seen on this body of work. The form language of this work is heavily influenced by Greek, Attic, black, and red figure pottery. Voluptuous swelling bellies contrast angular shoulders and rims and narrow feet. These pieces are dramatic, and the skill required to make them is undeniable. I'm also interested in San Ildefonso and Mata Ortiz pottery, two cultures who decorate their pots with intricate geometric brushwork and are pit fired to produce a blackened surface. This highly ornate style was influenced by classical Mimbres pottery shards found in northern Mexico, Arizona, and New Mexico. When the lines are carved into the surface, light is reflected in various directions, almost like a diamond, creating highlights and shadows emphasizing the pattern. This became one of my favorite unintentional effects with this work and something I began to embrace. By varying the direction of the lines often and at contrasting angles, I could harness this effect to produce a myriad of shades within the carbon black. The carved stoneware has an almost velvety quality to it after the final smoke firing. To contrast this surface and create movement and emphasis, I apply a layer of terra sigillata to the uncarved areas to burnish the raw clay body. During the post-fire reduction, the sidge can acquire a metallic appearance when exposed to heavy reduction. While I understand how to make this happen and encourage this effect on my pieces, the results can bring some spontaneity into the otherwise tight and meticulously planned pot. This body of work also opened opportunities to work with designers and other industries. While I love to make work that can enhance people's living spaces, I wasn't actively engaging in how those pots would interact within the environment. I've established a great working relationship with Dan Mazzarini, an interior designer in New York City, and he has opened my eyes to the ways in which these, and I'm going to put in quotes, non-functional pots can be incorporated into someone's home. Function within pottery is often thought of as pots that can hold or serve food or drink, but pots can also serve an aesthetic purpose. The Greek pots that I love and reference formally are a perfect example of vessels that have progressed beyond function and now serve as historical documents that catalog life from over 2,500 years ago. Much of my knowledge prior to grad school was self-taught and through experimentation, but I yearned to understand more about the chemistry involved with creating clay bodies and glazes and how different firing styles could produce different results. As someone who is a hands-on learner and does best with the guidance of a mentor or advisor, I began to consider grad school so I could study under some of the nation's most knowledgeable ceramicists. This is what led me to Lincoln, Nebraska. One of my professors, Pete Pinnell, is considered by many to be one of the most knowledgeable glaze chemists in the country. His understanding of how glaze melts, how it's chemically altered, and depending on the firing atmosphere, and how metal oxide, opacifiers, and glass former can be modified to achieve a specific surface is second to none. The work I developed while in grad school focused on form, user experience, material research, and how those elements can be harnessed to create a finely crafted object. Because I have a background in design, I tend to think like a designer prior to sitting down at the wheel. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? Who is my audience? And how do I want users to interact with the object? With those questions in mind, I start by sketching the object I want to create, consider how the glaze will complement the surface, and most importantly, how the user will interact with the object. With my newfound love for glaze chemistry, glaze feel has become particularly important to me, and I try to formulate glazes that are both interesting to look at and also extremely smooth to the touch. Satin matte glazes have a very distinct feel to them in contrast to their glossy cousins. They're often described as buttery to the touch, and people almost immediately comment on the feel when interacting with this body of work for the first time. Because I utilize design thinking when concepting my work, interaction is always a consideration when I begin a new piece. I'm also a form junkie, even when the surface may say otherwise. I'm most concerned with the silhouette of the pot, hence the name of this presentation. I always sit down at my wheel with either a clear vision in my head or a rendering of the form I'm about to make. To demonstrate how I use design in my ceramic work, I'll be using this coffee set from my thesis exhibition. I started with a sketch of the coffee pot itself, the piece I deemed to be the most important vessel in the set. Its sheer size relative to the others creates hierarchy, a principle of design I often utilize. When I'm sketching a vessel, I create subtle variations within the form until I land on something that feels well proportioned. Proportions are obviously subjective, but after years of making and studying both historical and contemporary vessels, we as artists develop our own sensibilities and use that intuition to guide our work. The idea of iterative design is a methodology well known within the design community. This process involves prototyping, testing, analyzing, and refining a product until a desired effect is achieved. The spout of these coffee pots has proven to be quite challenging, but analyzing, iterating, refining, and testing a form are what keeps my studio practice interesting and fresh. I use the term subtle and nuanced often when describing this work. The difference in form between the last sketch and this is an example of that idea. The volume on the last piece continued outward after the undercut just above the foot, creating lift before continuing to curve back inward after the waist. This piece, on the other hand, has a lower and less voluptuous center of gravity, grounding the piece and giving it a heavier presence. This is a more dramatic shift in form, elongating and narrowing the vessel, but applying the same principles as the previous sketches. All three have a narrow foot, a graceful continuous curve, and a short neck or gallery where the lid sits, which again mimics the profile of the foot. Movement and how the viewer's eye interacts with my work is also important when making pots with a quiet surface that lacks extraneous adornments. I create movement through dynamic shifts in form, allowing the glaze to break and pool in these areas to emphasize the transition. If you look closely, you notice the glaze breaking across the sharp transitions, allowing the dark clay body to peek through. This isn't a happy accident courtesy of some unpredictable fluke in the glaze firing. I intentionally formulate my glazes to move in the kiln but not run. I like to say they settle as they're fired, pooling in the crevices that are incised around the joints and falling away from the high spots to expose the clay body below. The sharp edge guiding the viewer's eye from the bottom. Oh, sorry. The handle also exhibits this characteristic, aligning perfectly between the neck and body. The sharp edge guiding the viewer's eye from the bottom of the foot to the rim, across the neck, and eventually meeting the top of the spout. Repetition is another principle of design that is embedded within my work. While again subtle, the angle that's created between the foot and the body of all these pieces in the set is repeated over and over. This repetition creates unity amongst individual pieces, establishing a cohesive whole amongst ostensibly disparate parts. I also like to think about negative space when creating sets, which is highlighted in the cream and sugar set. The two pots, seemingly unrelated as individuals, are brought together by their parallel but mirrored curves. This relationship is again reiterated in the curves of the coffee pot and mugs. Design has been and continues to be a very important part of my process, whether it's considering user interaction or how I can improve an object's purpose so my clients continue to utilize my work within their daily lives. Design thinking will continually guide my research in the pursuit of the idealized pot. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it.